Hey everyone.
There you go.
How are you all doing? Enjoying your Saturdays? All right. All right, who are we missing? Hello, everyone. Hopefully you guys saw my message in the Discord. It went through an installation of PostgreSQL. If not, it's also kind of fine if you haven't done that. Most of our session is actually just working on the actual backend server. You just won't be able to test your server. That would be the only downside if you haven't installed it just yet. But if you did, awesome. That'd be very helpful.
It didn't break my computer, Eddie. When I did it last night, I was scared.
Nice. Okay, it seems like I think we're missing a few people.
Off the top of my head, I feel like Lulu and Tristan are missing.
Lulu, Tristan, Pari, and Kieran had to drop out. Okay.
Okay, let me see.
All right, so just, I guess we'll wait a few more minutes before we really get started. But yeah, so today is mostly just going to be server, backend stuff. Last time we kind of did a quick overview of everything and we jumped into React, our front end. Today's all going to be backend. All right. So has anyone actually done anything involving like a backend framework or anything? Jimmy, just a little bit. No one else. So this is all hopefully going to be all completely new to most people, it seems like. So that should be exciting.
Is PHP a backend? Is that right?
Yeah, PHP is backend. I think depending on how you use it though, because I think it could also be used for front end as well. Not too familiar with PHP, but you definitely can use PHP for backend. All right. I guess we'll wait another minute or so. Jimmy, do you have a joke off the top of your head that you'd want to share with everyone?
Oh, that's a good question. Always a good question. No, I only have, okay, well, let's see. What do you call fake spaghetti? Impasta.
That was a good one.
Did you get that one from Sage?
No, okay, so he had it. I think maybe I did get it from him actually. I think I did.
Sage
I usually
has
steal my jokes from the kids.
Such good jokes. Kelvin, this is Cash's brother. Every time when I used to check him in, kills me with the jokes.
He tells one every session?
Yeah.
That's pretty solid.
Nice.
He told me one was what's green and sings. Elvis Parsley.
That's a good one.
All right. right, well, I guess we'll get started. So, to kind of get started also, I actually came up with a kind of like basically a schedule of what exactly we're going to be doing. I think I can actually post it in the Discord so you can all have access to it. It's literally just basically a Google Doc of literally exactly what we're going to go through. That'll probably help for those who are visual learners as well, so who can kind of like see all the processes and things that we're going to be doing, because we're going to be doing quite a bit. I also put in a lot of links to kind of help explain certain terminology as well, since I don't know if I'll be able to cover everything. So you might want to like look at that on your own time or even just browse through it. But yeah, so that's basically the schedule we're going to be kind of going through. Yeah, so in the beginning, I kind of put like some helpful links that we might look at later. But if you're more interested, you can definitely look at that on your own time. And yeah, we're basically just gonna jump right into it. So let's see. So first things first, you guys can kind of navigate to where you created your React app. This will just kind of make things easier, just so it's all in kind of like one place. Again, or in this sense, we can kind of create our server in like an entire folder or directory anywhere that we want to. But just to make it a little cleaner and kind of condensed, we'll put it in the same directory. Here I have all the code from last time we created all of our components and stuff, all of our other code and stuff. So yeah. So first things first, what we want to do is, I didn't even write this. What we want to do is we want to create a different directory, right? So in here, we're going to create an entirely new folder. We can just call it backend, because that's literally all of our backend code where it's going to be. And we also want to open up a terminal, because that would be very helpful for us. All right, so we have a terminal. And here we want to navigate into our backend folder that we just created. So if you created it on your actual like text editor, make sure you get cd into it. All right, so now we're inside of our folder backend. All right, and we have nothing inside of it. All right, so now here, I'm also going to kind of go over how to just even create a node package. Basically how to create a node application. The first thing that we want to do is run the command npm init. That basically initializes a node package module. So here we're going to do npm init, making sure that we're inside of our backend directory. All right. When you run this command, this kind of questionnaire kind of thing is going to pop up. You kind of have to type in certain things like what your package name is. Most of this stuff doesn't necessarily matter, and we can mostly change it later. All of it's just going to be stored inside of something called the package.json, which we have for our React app already. So here we can just call it backend version 1.0 is fine. Description, backend for our to-dos. All right, and now here for the entry point, we want it to be server.js. Now doesn't necessarily matter, just makes things a little clearer of what we're going to be doing. Since this is our backend, it's mostly going to be running a server. So it makes sense to call it server.js. So we'll call it server.js. We won't have any test commands. We don't have any Git repository link to it, but you can always add to that as well. Any keywords associated to it, you can also add here, but we can skip that. You can feel free to put yourself as the author. Again, most of the stuff we can kind of just skip. at the end, it kind of shows you what your package.json is going to look like, right? So it has all of this stuff, pretty simple. Type in yes to continue, and now we have a package.json. All right, so now this package.json is specific to this directory. It's all of this stuff we can kind of ignore for now, all right, because we're just focusing over here. All right, so that's how we create our node package. All right, and now we need to install a few modules that we're going to be using when creating this backend.
Real quick,
So-
Eddie, do you mind scrolling up to the parameters again that you input?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So here, most of this doesn't necessarily matter.
cool.
The only like main part is this one. But even if you didn't type anything, you can always change it inside of your package.json. So like if you accidentally didn't change this would say index.js, which you can just manually change in your package.json, and it should be fine.
Cool. Thanks.
But everything else is just mostly optional. Probably good to actually do, but for now, we'll just skip it for now. All right. So now the next thing is we actually want to install the modules that we want to use. All right. So we're going to start off by doing the ones that we're going to use specifically for our server. So here we're going to do, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Here in our terminal, we're going to do an npm install. In this case, we're going to be installing these modules. We're going to say -- save to make sure that it's saved to our to this specific package.json. And then here we just need to specify the modules that we're going to be using. The first one is going to be Express. All right, this is basically how we're going to create our application that handles our backend. Right, this one's probably the more important one. Next is going to be PG, which is going to stand for PostgreSQL. This just allows us to use Postgres connected to our Express app. We also need to add pg-h store. That's just kind of, I forget exactly why we need that, but it's mostly for like an add-on to PG that helps with connecting to our database. Then we need to have our way that we are actually going to be connecting to our database. We're going to be using something called SQLize. All right, this is a database ORM, or object relational mapping tool, that basically is used to interface both with our Express app with our PostgreSQL database. So it's basically kind of like a way to talk to our server with the database server. All right. And then after SQLize, we also need body parser. Body parser is a middleware that's able for us to understand what the request body is going to be. So if you recall from last time, I talked about how sending a request from your browser to a server, we need to understand what is being sent through that request. In this case, we send information through the body. So we need to be able to parse through that body to actually understand and read what's in there. So we use something called body parser. There are other body parsers out there that we can use. I think Express might have a built-in one too, but I like using body parser. All right, and then I think the last thing that we need is cores. So now cores is probably one of the more complicated things. Basically, it's a way for us to allow cross-origin resource sharing. Now, what that means is if you're trying to get kind of like multiple things from the same location, you'll run into an error that says, oh, this is not allowed. And it'll probably give you like big red letters that says course not allowed. This just allows that, so that way we can access the information that we need to, and we don't have, and then we can basically use the same computer to host both of our backend and our front end. All right, that makes things just a lot easier. We won't really see a lot of this error for now. We'll probably see it once we start integrating our front end with our back end though. All right, but this is just something we're going to just add on right now. And then, yeah, once you hit enter, it's going to start installing all of these. And I mentioned something called middleware. So now middleware is essentially different kind of like mini applications that we can kind of put to our main application to kind of make things flow a lot easier, right? Body parser is a middleware. Cores is a middleware as well. There are actually a lot of different middlewares that we can use that have like different functionalities. And yeah, so that's basically it. You can actually, if you looked at the schedule that I posted in the Discord where you can like see what we have, I also linked where you actually can view the documentation for all of these modules. So that'd be very helpful to look at if you're interested. All right, so now once that's installed, your package.json should now include all of these dependencies. All right, so now that means our application that we're going to make depends on these modules. It depends on body parser, on cores, express, PG, PGH store, and SQLize. That means when someone tries to install your application, it will install these modules because it depends on them. All right, so now that we've installed these modules, there's one more we're going to install, but this one's slightly different. This one is needed for our actual server when we actually are using it. We're going to install one for more development purposes, something that kind of just makes our lives easier. So typically, when you are running a server, if you make changes to the server file itself, you'll need to refresh the server so that it can update with the new changes. And that can get annoying. So I'm going to install a module that just makes it so that it auto refreshes for us. So in order to do that, we're going to do, again, npm install -- save. But in this case, we're going to say -dev, saying that it's going to be a development only dependency, only for development purposes. And the one that we're going to be using is called nodemon, if I can spell that correctly. Nodemon. All right. So now that's going to install. Perfect. And notice in your package.json, it doesn't get included in the dependencies, but it made its own dev dependencies. Because here, we can say if we're in a development mode for this application, we depend on this module. But for instance, when we eventually deploy this, this module will not be needed, and thus it won't get installed when we deploy our actual server. But yes, that's the basic setup of just creating a package, a node package module. We need to actually create all the files now. All right, so first things first, we need to create that server.js, right? Here we have the main, meaning the way that our entry point to our application. So we need to create server.js. So inside of backend, we're going to create a file, server.js. All right, and now we have server.js. All right. And another thing, also to make things a little easier, we can add what's called scripts. If you look back at the React package.json, you'll notice that it also has some scripts. These were kind of auto-written for us. And that's just the way that when you run a create React app, it auto does this for you. Here, it has a script called start, which basically just runs the React scripts start command. So that way, when you actually run your React server, all you have to do is just npm start. So here, what we're going to do in our package.json for our backend, making sure that we're in the backend one, we're going to add a script to also do something similar like that. All right. So here, we're going to do start. And here, we're going to do, where is it? Yes. Oh, I think I had it for a second. There we go. There we go. Yes. We want to run our server using nodemon. So we're going to be saying nodemon server.js. So basically, we're just going to have it so that we can just easily say npm start, which will then run this script, which will run our server using the module nodemon that we installed. All right. So once you have this set up, that should be it for our package.json. Make sure you save. Also, if you're not familiar with what a JSON is, this kind of structure might look unfamiliar to you. I also put a link down to kind of like explain what a JSON is. But essentially, it's just a bunch of, it's like an object that has key and value pairs. These key and value pairs need to have double quotation marks, unless they're either, I believe, a Boolean or an integer or some number value. But everything else needs to have double quotation marks. So here we have a key of start that needs to be in double quotation marks, and a value of nodemon server.js, which also needs to be in double quotation marks. So JSON is basically just like a specific format of how things are written. All right, so now that we have this in our package.json, we could probably close that, and we're pretty much done with that. All right. So now what we need to do is basically create our server.js now. We kind of need to fill this up so that we can actually create our application and run our server. All right. So here we need to start off with actually requiring Express. So here we're going to create a constant called Express, and we're going to require our module Express. And what we're also going to do is we're going to make a few more constants as well. We're going to make one for our body parser and as well as cores. So this was very similar to what we did on the front end where we had to require things. This is basically just importing them into our current file so that we can use the specific functions and methods associated to this module. And the names that you put here should be, that should correspond to the actual module name. So when we installed it, we did body-parser, so that's why we're requiring it like that. All right. Now that we have all of our requires pretty much done, we need to actually create our app. So this is going to be fairly simple. We just create a variable called app and set it equal to a call to express. And there we go. We have our application. All right. But now we need to do a few things before we can actually get this server running. All right. So first things first, we need to actually apply these middlewares of body parser and cores. All right, we need to actually make them attached to our application. So in order to do that, we just say app.use. And now here we can place any middleware that we want, and it will be attached to our application. So first things first, we can work with CORS. So we just make a call to CORS. It has options that you can pass in as well, but for now, we'll leave it empty. Because again, we don't necessarily need to worry about that right now, but it's a good thing to have at the moment. All right. Next thing we need to use is body parser. App.use body parser. And now here, we need to specify the different types of information that we're going to be getting. So sometimes the types of data that we get might differ. Some browsers and some different applications might send requests in different ways and different forms. Here, we're going to worry about if someone sends a request via JSON. So we need to make sure that we can read the body if it's in a JSON format. Another one we should also check for is URL encoded. This one's just to make sure that it's just another format that we can check for. URL encoded. And in this case, we need to specify that extended is true. That's just a kind of like a setting that we need to have to make sure that if this kind of format of the request is sent, that we can kind of read it. And there's more formats we can add as well, but these are probably the more common ones. But for now, they should be fine. Most of the time, from what I've experienced, is JSON's probably the most common one, but there might be some other things that may not use JSON. So it's good to have multiple ways to parse your body. All right, perfect. Now that we've attached our middleware to our application, now we need to actually get working on our server. But before we do that, we need to create a route. So now I talked about requests, right? So there are different types of requests that we can get. The most simple type of request that we can get is called a GET request. Basically, that's just saying we are getting information. So what we're going to say is whenever we get a GET request, so app.get, and here we need to specify our route. Here we're going to say if someone goes to our / route, our home route of where our server is located, we want to do something. In this case, we need to have some type of handler or a function. So we're going to create a simple function, in which case we're going to have a request and a response based on it. And now if you remember back, here we're just going to do an arrow notation function, just to make it a little simpler for now. And all we really have to do for right now is send something. Here we can just say, hello there. All right. This is going to be temporary. We're going to be not needing this in the future, but we just are doing this to test our server to make sure it's working. All right. And last but not least, we need to actually start and run the server. So first thing we got to do is have our app listen at a specific port number. Now, port numbers are dependent on a lot of stuff that is outside of my realm of understanding. I just know that the most common one you would probably use is port 8080 for localhost. You could probably change this as well to any other port off of your computer that you can use. Be careful though, because there are some that are specific for other purposes. Like our PostgreSQL database runs on port, I believe, 5432. I'll double check on that after, but that's one you probably can't use. You might see like 8000 as well. React runs on 3000, But yeah, so here it doesn't necessarily matter, but just for simplicity's sake, we'll say 8080. And then here we need to have some type of handler, again, some type of callback function, in which case we don't necessarily need to pass in any arguments or parameters. So here we can just say, we can just have a simple console log message that says server is running. All right, and there we go. That is our server.js. We created our application. We added our middleware. We created a route that will listen for our specific paths that we are going to, and we are listening to a specific port so that our server is running. All right, so now we can test it out. Let's try doing npm start. So now when you do npm start, you should say server is running. And that's coming from this console log message right here. All right. And make sure that you have nodemon, because we're running through nodemon, it should work pretty fast. So here, if I were to change this to like say the server is now running and I save it, it auto refreshes the server and updates what it needs to do. So this is why we are using nodemon, makes things a lot easier. All right, and then we can also test our paths, our routes essentially. So here, we can actually go to localhost 8080 and actually see the specific response that we're getting back. So if we take a look at our code, we'll notice that here we are sending something. Well, what we're sending is literally just a message that says hello there. So if we go to that specific path or route, that's what we're getting. So perfect. Our server should be running. Awesome. All right, so now we have our application up. We have our server running. Now we need to go to the next part. Now we need to kind of set up our configuration files. So we need to make sure that we have the configuration set for the specific database that we're trying to access. Now, this is going to be maybe different for depending on how you set up your database. So I'll put an asterisk on that when we get there. All right, but first things first, we need to kind of organize our code because we're going to add a lot of files actually. All right, so inside of backend, we're going to add a new folder, and we'll call it app. This is basically the where our application code is going to be. That's not part of our server. This is mostly just for an organization purpose. You don't necessarily need to have this structure the way it is, but it just makes things a lot easier.
Hey, Eddie, I think some people are having trouble in the chat.
Oh no. I've totally been ignoring the chat. Oh no. Okay, let's see. Let's see. Ooh, when I typed npm sorry, I got errors with json.parse. Okay. What was the exact errors you were getting?
Yeah, so it just says, or it's a bunch of them, but it says failed to parse package.json data.
Oh, failed to parse package.json. Okay. Take a look at your package.json file. Make sure one, you have a comma right here in the scripts. Yeah, make sure there's a comma.
I think that might be it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's another thing with JSONs. If you are missing like one thing, it like completely freaks out. So yeah, make sure you add a comma, and then here this script should run. All right, and then Nick, is yours running too?
Okay, so there can't be a comma after line 8. That's what my problem was. Yeah.
Yes, that's another thing about JSON syntax is you can't have floating commas. because the JSON syntax expects another key value pair, and because there's not, it errors out. So there. Awesome. All right. Perfect. So now, yeah, hopefully you guys can kind of check your the server running, make sure if you go to the actual local host, it works, and it's actually printing out. All right. Cool. So now inside of our app directory or our app folder, we're going to create another folder. This one's going to be our config folder. All right. So now our config folder is literally just going to have our configuration inside of it. For right now, we only have one configuration that we need to handle, and that's with our database. So inside of our configuration, or our config folder, we're going to add a folder called db.config.js. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be named this. Again, this is just for organization purposes. Makes things a little easier to understand. Oh, this is the configuration for the database. All right. Okay. Now, we need to kind of go through here. The good news is this file is actually going to be fairly simple. We actually just need to export something, and what we're actually exporting is just going to be this object. So to actually export something, we need to say module.exports. And here, we're going to set it equal to some type of object. All right. And the main things that we need here are we need our host. We need a user. And I'll fill those in a little bit. We need a password. We need a database. And here we need a dialect. All right. So now this is where it's gonna be different for people depending on how you set up your database. Most of the time, the user and the password are going to be different, as well as this DB, which we'll get to later. But for now, we're going to say localhost for our host, essentially. That's where our server is running, so we want to make sure we put localhost. So here, we're going to say localhost. Ooh, and I actually am forgetting if this needs to be in a string or not. Let me double check. Yes, it needs to be a string. Localhost. Pretty simple. Now, for the user, if most of you followed the tutorial that I sent, you should have created a user called Postgres. Sometimes other tutorials or other ways to follow through, like a guide or something, might suggest you creating your username to be something else. But I would say like 98% of the time, you probably have created a user called Postgres. And now your password is probably going to be different depending on how you set up your password for your database. For me, I believe I called it 123. So this is going to be different depending on your password when setting up your database. We won't know if we get any errors until later on, but just know that we'll come back here in a little bit. And then here, this one's going to be interesting. So depending on if anyone created a database or not, this is going to be the name of the database. If you haven't created one yet, that's fine. We can just create it here. And it won't actually create the database, but it will refer to it later. So in this case, I'll call mine to-do. You can call yours to-dos. You can call it my first database, right? You can be whatever you want. The database name doesn't necessarily matter in terms of what it is. But yeah, to-do. Or if anything, I can also say like TCSB dash to-do. All right. And then last but not least, we're going to say our dialect. Basically, we're going to say which database language are we using? Here, we're using Postgres. And there we go. And that should be it for our config files. And normally, when you are setting up your config files, some of these might be kind of like very private information. So sometimes you might want to use like environmental variables, or when you're hosting your database, or not your database, but your server, these will probably go inside of specific variables depending on where you're hosting it. But we'll get into that later. But just know that putting your host, your password, and user should be fine for now. All right, so now we have our config file pretty much done. All right, next thing we got to do is we need to set up our models. So now our models are basically how the database is going to be structured. So now I haven't really talked about what a database is and how to even just create or access a database. That's mostly because we aren't going to be doing a lot of that. Most of the code that we have here kind of easily does it for us. But I'll probably go at the end of today, probably go over a little bit about Postgres, so that way we can cover at least a little bit of it. But just know we need to be able to create our database using models. So, organization purposes, inside of app, we're going to create a folder called models. Oh, wait a second, I want to make sure I have my structure fine. All right. Inside of app, I have config. I see. I see. Oh. Yeah, you don't want to do what I did and create the models inside of here. So here you can just delete it. And we want to create it in the app folder. All right, make sure you do it in the app folder. So here I'll make a directory called models. There we go. That looks a lot better. Config and models. All right. So yeah, don't do what I did. Make sure that it's inside of the app. You can do it in terminal or any other way. Okay, so now that we have our models folder, let's start creating our models. So the first thing we want to do is create a file called index.js. So now I'll get into why we want to call this index.js later, but there's a kind of a reason why we called it index.js. It just makes things slightly easier for us. All right. So now that we have our index.js, let's start coding in it. So first thing we want to do is be able to access the configurations that we added inside of our config file. So here we're going to create a constant and we'll call it db config, in which case we're going to require that specific JavaScript file inside of our config folder. So here we need to traverse outside of our models folder into our config folder and access db.config.js. Now here, the JS actually is fine. You don't necessarily need to put the JS, but I'm putting it just for clarity's sake. All right. So now here is where we're going to be using Sequelize. So if you recall, Sequelize allows us to directly connect and talk to our database server. This just allows us to make all the necessary changes and getting the information from our database a lot simpler and smoother. So what we need to do is we are going to get sequelize. All right, now this is going to be a little confusing at first, but this variable is going to be capital sequelize, because here we are just going to be requiring sequelize. All right, so here we're actually accessing essentially the class of sequelize, all of the information, functions, and methods associated to the sequelize module. And then we need to create another variable, which is going to be an instance of sequelize. So here we're going to create a new sequelize, in which case we need to pass in our database configuration, which is why we required it up on top. So here we're going to say db config, and we're going to pass in the database. We're going to say db config dot user, db config dot, I believe it's password. The Zoom window is blocking me. Yep. Password. And then here, we're going to pass in an object to kind of put everything else in. So we'll say host db config dot host. And then here we got to say dialect db config dot dialect. And I believe that should be it. And to kind of make this look a little nicer, we can kind of space this out so that way we see everything in our object. So essentially we're passing in our DB, our user, our password, the host, and the dialect. And yeah, we need to make sure that this is inside of an object, so the curly braces. Thank you, Nick. I totally would not have seen that. Yes, sequelize. Sequelize, perfect. All right, so now that we have our instance of sequelize, we need to create another object. This object is basically going to represent the database. It's not exactly the database, but it's mostly a way for us to just easily get the information or put the information into our database. So we're just going to call it DB for short. It's our database. All right. And what we need to do is we're going to actually put these objects that we created, these variables, into our database. The reason why we want to do that is so that it makes it easier for us to access the necessary functions, either specifically to sequelize or our instance of it with our specific connection. So here we'll just say db.sequelize and set it equal to sequelize. And we'll say db.lowercase sequelize equal to sequelize. All right, this puts it inside of our object. All right, and then last but not least, we're going to export it because we're going to be using this outside of here. So we have to do a module.exports, and we're just going to be exporting that specific object. All right, and now we're done for now. We'll get back to it in a second. All right, so basically this is just us using our configuration file, using sequelize to actually connect to our database. All right, we haven't really done much else. We need to, however, specify what's inside of our database. So a database can have a collection of different things inside of it. since we are using a relational database, we are going to be using tables. So essentially, we need to define each of these tables. The specific table that we're going to be creating is specific for a to-do, right? We need to define what is a to-do. And if you recall back in our React app, a to-do had a task, and it also had something called completed. So we need to make sure that our front end stuff, meaning the information we're getting from our front end, corresponds to our back end. So we need to make sure that those names are the same. They don't necessarily have to be the same. It just makes things a lot easier. And in some scenarios, if you're working on solely on either the front end or back end, you will probably see a lot of mismatched names because of not being able to work on both at the same time. All right. So we need to just explain what this to do is. So in our config file or config folder, we're going to make another file. This one is going to be specific to our to do that we're making. So here we're going to say to do model.js. All right, and now this file is basically going to explain what a to do is. This one's going to be a fairly simple one. All right, and now here we're literally just going to be exporting a function that just calls the Sequelize instance that we created back in our index.js and just return it. So just to make things easier, we're going to export it directly. So here we can actually export a function. So that's what we're going to be doing. Here we need to pass in our Sequelize and our Sequelize module, arrow notation function. And then here we'll create our to-dos. Think of this as the table. This is our table of to-dos. And here we need to actually call our Sequelize and define what a to-do is. So here we need to specify and call the method define. This kind of creates this or defines this table for this specific data that we're using. Here we can give it a name. In this case, it's a to-do, so we'll give it a name of to-do. And now here, we need to pass in some type of, basically, the options available to it. So here we can just create an object that kind of explains everything that's inside of a to-do. So the first thing a to-do needs is a task. So we'll clarify that it has a task. Inside of this task, we need to kind of say what type it is. If you're familiar with other coding languages, you need to declare types, right? In this case, databases work the same way. We need to make sure that if this task is a string, is it an integer, is it a Boolean? That's what we're doing here. So we need to declare that it's type. And this is why we are passing in our class of Sequelize, so we can access these specific constants. All right, so here we're saying it's a Sequelize string. All right, and I think I misspelled this. There we go. So yeah, this is the module class that we're passing in. Lowercase is our instance. So here we're just accessing our constant of string because our task should just be a string. All right, and then last for it to do, we need to let it know that if it has been completed. So we give it a completed. And in this case, this is going to be a type of Boolean, specifically a Sequelize Boolean. All right. And I believe all we have to do left is just, since we're inside of a function, we're going to return this to-dos. We could have also just returned it directly from here, but yeah. And that's our model for our to-do. Okay, so I know I've been kind of talking nonstop for quite some time, so I think now's probably a good time for like a 5-minute-ish break. Those of you who need to go to the restroom, definitely go ahead. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. And I guess we'll be back in like 5 minutes. And if you want to see something else, feel free to ask me. I can change it to whatever you need to see.
I had a question in the models folder for index.js.
Yeah.
When you add like capital sequelize and lowercase sequelize at the line 11 and 12,
Yeah.
what's the like purpose of the first line for the capital sequelize on
Yeah.
line 11?
Oh, line 11. Oh, I see. Okay, so yeah. The purpose here is so that way we can distinguish between the different types. So here we're creating a JavaScript object. So now another way I could have done it also was to say like sequelize colon sequelize. And that basically does the same thing as this line right here. So I'm just placing them inside of my object. The reason why we want to do that is when we actually are using this specific object later on, we need to use both information from the actual module, but also from our instance. So we need to make sure we have both available to us.
Okay, that's interesting because I saw that we created like an instance of that module, but we also need like the type of module in the database.
Right. So most of the reason why we need that is like, for instance, like when we need to get like constants, right? Like
Okay.
going back into our model, that's one way. And later on, we might need to use it for specifically accessing routes, which we'll talk about after. All right. Hopefully everyone is back. We'll keep going. All right, so far we've created our application. We've configured all of our information. we've set up all the models so that we confirm the structure of our database. And now the next thing we got to do is we have to kind of set up our controller. We need to be able to run a certain thing based off of our database object that we created here and actually make changes to our database. So the main things we want to do for our database stems from what are called CRUD functions. That might be something you might have heard here or there, but basically CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. Those are kind of like the 4 main things that your database should be able to handle. Specifically not necessarily the database to handle, but our server should handle. We want to be able to create a to-do. We want to be able to read the to-dos or be able to get the information about all the to-dos. We also want to update a to-do. We want to say whether it has been completed or not. And we also want to delete it. So that's what we're going to be working on next, is creating this controller so that we can kind of do all of these functions. Okay, so now we need to create another folder. So inside of our app folder, we're going to create a new folder called controller. All right, this is basically going to be the place where we're saying what we're actually doing with the database. Most of it is basically calling SQLized functions and methods to actually connect to our database and actually do the things that it needs to do. All right. So now inside of our controller, actually it'll probably make more sense to call it controllers, because sometimes you might need more than one controller. So I'll leave it as controllers. But for our purposes, we only have one controller. All right. So we're going to create a new file. We're going to say todo.controller.js. All right. So this is, again, not necessary to call it this way, but it just makes things a little easier to understand. It's the controller for our to-do. All right. Perfect. Now we need to actually get everything that we need to get done. So first things first, we need to grab that database object that we created inside of our index.js, right? We're exporting this object. Here, we're actually grabbing it and going to be doing stuff with it. All right. So we're going to create a constant called db, and we're going to require it from our models. So now here's kind of the tidbit as to why I called it index.js. If you don't specify a specific file, it's going to look for a file called index.js. So since we have both oh, I just realized I created my to-do models in the wrong folder. Okay, so for those of you who followed me and didn't realize it, but my to-do models should be in the models folder. But yes, in our models folder, we should have index.js and to-do model.js. So here, if we are just requiring something from models, the default thing it's going to look for is something called index.js. So here it's going to go to index.js and require whatever it's exporting. In this case, it's exporting that database object that we created, which is exactly what we want. Perfect. Now that we have our database, we're going to access this to-dos that we created inside of here. So we're going to here create another constant and call it to-do. And here we're going to say db.todos. All right, this accesses our to-dos from our database that we're grabbing. All right, and now we need to be able to do the 4 different functions that that I mentioned before. We need to be able to create, read, update, and delete. Right? So these are just comments I'm laying out just to specify what we're going to be doing. So for creating, here, there are different ways we can structure this. The way that I'm going to structure it is I'm going to export each one as a separate function. So the syntax of this might look a little funny, but just know I'm basically exporting multiple functions at a time. So here, I'm going to say exports.create. So here, I'm exporting a function called create, in which case, it's going to be very similar to our route that we created way back in our server.js. We need a request and a response. In which case, here, we need to create a arrow notation function. All right. And now inside here, we're going to do a simple validation check, mostly just to make sure that we're actually grabbing something and that we have something in our body. So we'll do a simple if statement that says if there's not a rec.body.task, meaning we haven't passed our body or we haven't passed anything to our body called task, then we want to send an error message that says, hey, you didn't send a task. So here we're going to say res.status 400. And now I should probably mention about status codes. Some of you might be familiar with like a status code 404. There's a bunch of different status codes we can send. 400 means it was a user failed request. So here we're just saying it's a 400 request. It's a more general status response. And here we'll just send a message saying to do needs a task, right? We need to make sure we send a task. And then we want to make sure we return and we stop doing what we're going to be doing after, which is actually adding it to our database. So this is not necessarily needed, but it's just an added protection so that we don't add empty to-dos in our database. All right. So now that that's out of the way, we need to create our to-do. So we're going to create a simple to-do object, in which case it needs to have 2 things. It needs to have the task, which we are going to get from our request, specifically the body, and specifically something that is called task. So now here, whenever we do rec.body, because we've added our body parser middleware, we're able to actually understand what's inside of it. If we didn't have a body parser, we wouldn't actually be able to read this body. All right, so make note of that. That's pretty helpful, at least. All right, so now that we have our task, we also need to make sure that it has a completed. In which case, we're going to kind of make a simple ternary statement that checks to see if we have a completed in our body. If it is, we'll pass it in. Otherwise, we'll just default it to false. So we'll say rec.body.completed. If that exists, we're going to set it rec.body, or we're going to set it to rec.body.completed. Or we're just going to set it to false. So here, basically what this is saying is we may not have a completed part in our rec.body. And this could happen on the front end. Sometimes the front end may not send a part of the body that the back end might need. So here we need to check to make sure that if it does exist, then we'll set it to that. Otherwise, we'll give it a default value. All right. Now that we have our to-do object, we now need to create our to-do. So now here we're going to be accessing our to-dos finally. So here we're going to say to-do.create. in which case we're going to pass in our to-do object with all of this information, and it's actually going to connect to our database server and actually create it. So now what actually happens here is that this returns what's called a promise. I won't get into too much about a promise, but essentially, because we're making a bunch of requests, these requests, they don't typically happen instantaneous. There's some time that it takes for a request to go somewhere and get a response back. So what a promise does is it actually waits for it to resolve, meaning we get a response back, and then we can do something afterwards. So we can actually link methods on top of it to say, after it has been resolved, or after we have gotten a response, we want to do something, in which case we will say a dot then on top of it. Now, I just put it on another line just to make sure that it's a little clearer to understand and that it's part of this to-do.create. So now what we actually get is some type of data. And then here, we want to do something. So what we need to pass into this dot then is a function. So here we're going to be getting some data, and we want to do something with that data. The very simplest way to do anything is to just res.send our data. There we go. And now this is also not as needed, but we probably should check to make sure if this has created successfully, but also check to make sure that if there's an error, we send the appropriate error message. So we also need to add a dot catch. This dot catch actually catches any errors that happens. And we're going to be doing quite a bit of catches here in our other functions that we're going to create. So here, we're going to be getting some type of error. And in here, we're going to set our status message to 500. Now, a status error of 500 means that it's the server side's error, meaning the server didn't actually do what it was supposed to. Some error happened on the server's end. So here we'll say, sorry, it was our bad. And we'll send an appropriate message. And here we'll say, if there is a message attached to this error, we'll use it. Otherwise, we'll just say error occurred when creating the to-do. Or just a simple error message. And there we go. And that's how we create a to-do. So now we basically need to do the same idea for both, or for all of our read, update, and delete functions that we need to create. These other ones aren't going to be as complicated because we don't need to do any checks per se. This was just added bonus. We don't necessarily need it, but it's just a kind of nice to have. All right, so now let's be able to read all of our to-dos. So again, I'm going to export something. In this case, I'm going to say exports read, right? Because it's our read function. And again, it's going to be a function that has a request and a result and a response. And now here, we need to be able to this one's actually going to be a lot easier. All we have to do is just say to-do.find all. This is just a specific SQLized method. I actually had to look into the documentation to actually find this. It wasn't as clear as I can easily find, but this is the one that basically grabs all of our to-dos, or all of our data in a specified table. We specify the table here, and here we're getting all of them. So we'll say find all. And here we actually don't need to pass anything because we're not actually giving anything to it. So that's it. And just like all the other, just like our .create method, it also returns a promise. So we have to say .then. In this case, we are also going to get some data. Same thing as what we did before. We need to make sure that we send that data. This one is actually more important because we need to make sure we're sending all of the data to our front end. Otherwise, our front end won't be able to actually list out every single to-do. All right. And then again, another catch where we will get some type of error, in which case we will also send another status error of 500, in which case we will also send another message. We will add the message that came with the error if it was there, or we'll say some error occurred when getting all of the to-dos. This message doesn't necessarily matter. You can just name it whatever you want. Here we're just checking to make sure that if there is a message attached to our error, we'll send that. But if there's not, we have some default value. All right, and that's it for our read. We're able to find all of our to-dos, grab the data, send it, and catch if we get an error. All right, perfect. Now we need to do our update. So just like our other ones, we gotta export it. We'll call it update. Again, it's going to be a function that has a request and a response. Now in here, we need to know what to do we're actually updating. So now this is going to be fairly interesting, and we'll get into this when we talk about the different routes. But here, we're going to be using something called params. Depending on our route, we will specify which to-do we are actually updating. So instead of how we did in our create, where we were able to get the information by getting it from body, we're actually going to be getting it from params. So here, what we actually need is this associated ID. So we're going to create a variable called ID and set it equal to rec.params.id. All right, now we have the associated ID for which to-do we are updating. And now we need to do a to-do.update. But this one is going to be fairly interesting because we need to pass in two things for our update. We need to say what we're updating and some type of condition, right? Because we need to specify the new values of what's being updated as well as what is actually being updated. So what's actually being updated? Well, in this case, we'll use our rec.body. All right. Anything that we get with this request, we're going to be using that information that you put in the body and apply it to our database. All right. And now we also need to set a condition, in which case we need to check to see where the ID of our to-do is equal to our to-do variable that we got from our params. So this is basically just checking for a condition where the to-do that's inside of our database, if it has an ID that's associated to the one that we are saying on our route. All right, so now that we have that, we now need to do our dot then. So now what gets returned is actually slightly different than what we were getting in the previous ones. Normally we would get some type of data, but in this case, since we're only like updating one or deleting one, we're actually going to get a number back. So we actually need to check what this number is. So here, we are going to check to see what this number is. So first things first, we're going to create a variable called message. This just makes it a little easier so that we only have to do one send. In this case, we need to check to see if num is 1, meaning if we've successfully updated a to-do, it'll give us the number 1. If it's 0, then it did not successfully update. So we want to make sure that our message corresponds to what happens. So if we successfully update it, we'll say to-do was updated, something along those lines. Otherwise, we want our message to say to-do was not updated. Right? Pretty simple. And then here, we would just send, no matter what, our message. There we go. So here we're sending the key message with our variable message that we set if it was 1 or if it was something else. And again, this number would only be 1 if it was updated, since we are only updating one to do. All right. Now that we have our, then we need to make sure we catch for any errors. So just like the other ones, we're going to do our catch statement where we will get an error. And if we get an error, we will do res.status 500, sending a specific error message. And in this case, we know for sure that an error happened. So we don't necessarily need to check to see if there's an error message, but we can. Error message, or we can kind of do something that says error with updating to do with ID, and doing some string interpolation. I pass in the variable ID in here. So in JavaScript, specifically ES6, I believe, version of JavaScript, to do string interpolation, you need to use backticks. So if you want to like have an error message that says, oh, cannot update to do with ID, the actual the ID number, make sure you use backticks with the $sign and curly braces. And that's how you string interpolate. All right. And now that should be it for our catch, for our update. All right. And last but not least, we need to delete. This one is going to be fairly similar to the update, where we need to make sure we get an ID of which to-do we're deleting. So we'll get that from our params, and then we'll get some type of number. If that number was 1, it was successfully deleted. Otherwise, it wasn't. So basically, this is going to be a rehash of the update, just using the specific sequelize method to actually get it to work. So here, exports.delete. Again, rec res, same consistent thing. Here, got to do the exact same thing, getting the ID from rec.params.id. And then here, the method is actually called destroy. And in this case, since we are just focused on deleting the to-do, we don't need to specify what's being updated, but we still need to pass in some type of condition of what to-do we're deleting. So it's going to be a similar object where we say where ID, ID, ID. And then, like the other one as well, we need to say .then, check to make sure that we're getting some type of number, create a message, compare the num. If it's 1, we'll set the message to be to-do was deleted. Else, message was to-do was not deleted. And then just like the other one, res.send, message, message. All right, that's our then. Then our last but not least, our catch. We'll get some error, res.send or res.status. You don't necessarily have to send a status. This is just more helpful to let the user know what happened. And since we know that it's for sure a server-side error, sending a status is 500. Sending a status error 500 is helpful for them. All right, here, message error.message, or some type of message that says error with deleting to do with ID. There we go. All right. And that is basically all of our controller for our to-do. This one is by far the longest piece of code we're going to do. So once we have this, everything else should be a lot easier. So yeah, I'll take a, if anyone needs me to scroll up or anything, I definitely can, but yeah.
This is kind of like semantics, but how do we know when to add like a semicolon at the end of like a parenthesis or like at the end of a clause?
Got you. So in JavaScript, in objects, so whenever you're using like curly braces, you do not want to end a line with a semicolon. The objects usually just have key value pairs, so that's when you know that you shouldn't end it with a semicolon. But since this is literally just a method call, you can just end it with a semicolon. Typically, you don't necessarily also need to have semicolons in JavaScript. It's mostly just JavaScript won't yell at you the way that like other languages like Java will. But yeah, another instance is if like you're chaining methods. So like here, when I did my then, putting a semicolon here will give me an error because then it won't be able to chain the method of catch on top of it. So that's another way of not doing a semicolon. So those are the main things of just not adding a semicolon. But if you forget to add a semicolon like right here, it's totally fine. I'm probably gonna forget some semicolons too. So like if anyone, if it is something that you notice, you can easily just point it out and I'll fix it. But yeah.
Thank you.
All right, so that was basically the bulk of everything. Once we have this done, should be a lot easier now. So now we've created our application, we've set up our configuration, we've created the models that needed, and we've basically set up what we're doing with our database. Now we need to actually set up the routes. So if you recall, going back to server.js, we created a route. Now, what I mean by a route is where this location is going to. Since we set our config file host to be localhost, we are basically checking this specific location. And the route that we're going to is actually the slash route. So by adding the slash route, if this request is made, we're going to go here. But let's say, for instance, I were to put the word potato for whatever reason. Well, then I would need to make sure that I have a route that says potato, and that would take me to that specific route. Right? So now we're not going to make a route called potato because that doesn't necessarily make sense. So we're going to kind of go through the route conventions, which are RESTful. So now I added a link in the schedule or the doc that I posted in the Discord talking about RESTful routes. At least I hope I did. Basically, there's a convention of how we create these different routes depending on what we're trying to do. Normally, if we're trying to do some type of get request, this would mean that we're getting all the potatoes that we have available to us. In this case, probably the one that makes more sense is if we were to do like slash to-dos. That's the one that we would try to get the to-dos. But if I were to add like /1, I would get the specific to-do that has the ID of 1. So this would be the route path that I would need to keep track of so that if someone goes to this route, I need to do something. So now the tricky thing is this route can apply to multiple things. This can also apply to both updating as well as deleting. Now that depends on the type of request that we're getting. So I mentioned earlier that there are get requests. Well, there's also 3 other ones that we can do as well, which is what we're going to be using. A post request actually sends data to us. For instance, when we are creating a to-do, we need to make sure that we send the task. We need to say what exactly our task is. So that request is going to send some data to us. That's going to be a post request. Another type of request would be and if I need to make sure I get this correct, yes, it is a put request. It also depends on what kind of platform you're using, but it can also be called patch, I believe. But a put request is also sending data to, but you're not creating a new type of information. In this case, it would mostly be used for updating, right? So we would need to use a put request when updating something. And then the last one would be delete, which is straightforward, is just for deleting. All right, so we're gonna create those different routes and make sure that we have it available to us. So we're going to create one last final folder in our app. That is going to be called routes. All right, so let's create a folder in our app called routes. And inside of routes, we're going to create a new file called todo.routes.js. Again, naming convention makes things a lot easier to understand. All right, so now this one is going to be fairly easy, and we're basically going to be accessing our controller that we created in here and using these specific functions to actually apply it to the specific routes that we want them to apply to. All right, so here, first thing we got to do is we want to export. What we're actually going to export is a simple function. This function is actually going to take in our Express application. And I'll talk about that once we actually start using this. And there's a reason why we want to do this. All right. And now inside of this function, we're going to get our controller. So we need to require our .. And I just want to make sure I get the name right. Pretty sure it was a to-do controller. So we need to go inside of our controllers /todo.controller.js. And again, if you name your files slightly off or different, make sure they're the same as yours. So now we have our controller. Basically, we have access to those functions we just created. All right. Next thing we need is we need to create some type of router. This is fairly simple because Express actually allows us to create a router. So we're just going to grab Express and create a router object from it. This just makes things more simplified. Essentially, instead of having to write all of these the way that it's written here, we're just going to simply just write it in one line and kind of put them all together in one simple, nice package. All right. So now here, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We need to be able to create, we need to be able to read, we need to be able to update, and we need to be able to delete. So we need to come up with our create path. So this one, we're going to access our router, and here is going to be a post request. Remember, post requests, we're sending data. Creating a to-do, we're going to be sending the data to our server. So we're going to make a post request. Now here, I'm going to say the slash route, and I'll explain why I need to do that once I finish all of these. All right, and here, I need to access that specific function from my controller. In this case, controller.create. And if you notice, there's a lot of simplification by creating the functions the way that I did. Since we want to go to our create route, we use our create function. Makes things a lot easier. All right. Next, we need to do our read route. In this case, this is our get request. We're grabbing all of the to-dos. In this case, it's also going to be a slash route. And here, we're going to say controller.read. Again, pretty simple. Now we need to do our update. So now here, we're going to make a put request. Here, we're not actually just creating something new. We're actually going to be updating something. So it's going to be a put request. So we say put. In this case, this is where I'm going to say /:ID. So now here, this is where the difference between our rec.body and our rec.params come into place. If we look back into our to-do controller, specifically in our update, we access our rec.params. So now here, the reason why I came up with ID is specifically so I can put ID here. So this is just a representative of some actual number. So for instance, if I were to do like to-dos /1, that 1 will be a kind of like a variable with the value, with the name of ID. If I were to name this like potato, I don't know why I'm coming up with potato, but potato comes off. So if I do potato here in my controller, I can say rec.params.potato, right? And yeah, that's the idea behind that. All right, now here, I need to make sure I access my update function. All right, and then last but not least, I got to do our delete, in which case we're going to make a delete request. So we're going to say .delete. Also, similar to our update, we're going to say /ID. And again, we're going to say controller.delete, accessing the function, right? Fairly simple. But now the last thing we have to do is kind of put all of this together into our app that we're making. So here we're passing in our actual application. Well, this router is actually a middleware. And if you recall back to the beginning, middleware makes our application a lot easier to kind of piece everything and kind of tunnel everything together. Router is a middleware we can use that allows our routes to kind of be put together. So here, we're going to say app.use. But now, since this is a specific router, we're going to specify the specific route we're going to be using. In this case, we will say API/todos. And here, we're going to pass in our router object that we created and added all these different routes. So now, I'll explain why I did the slash here and just the colons here. So by convention, we are creating something that's like a API. So for those of you who don't know what an API is I linked, I think, something in the documentation. So you probably have to look into that if you want. But basically, we're making an API. That's what this server essentially is like an API. If certain requests come to us, we want to make sure that we return or respond in an appropriate manner. In this case, we're dealing with all of our to-dos. So here, what happens is that this path comes before all of these, since we're using our router object. So essentially, these paths for our create is actually /API/to-do /. For our update, /API/to-do/:ID, right? This kind of puts them together so that we use this specific path. All right, and that should be it for our routes. All right, we're almost there. Final home stretch. So now that we've created our routes, we now need to make sure we are using it inside of our application, basically back in our server.js. So let's head back into our server.js. All right. Now here, we don't necessarily need this route anymore, but you can keep it there just for simplicity's sake. And now what we need to do is we need to be able to get what we have in our routes and place it in here. So what we'll do is we're going to require our app/routes/todo.routes.js, which will access that specific function that we're returning, in which case we need to pass in our app, like how I mentioned before. And now this will now run this specific application, which is the application we're building, and apply the router middleware to kind of put together all of our routes. And there we go. And now we get an app crash. Controller is not defined. Oh no. Oh, I did not spell something right.
Oh, in like controller.update, you're missing an R.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. Okay. So now comes the time where we should finally test our server, essentially. But we'll run into a few problems. And depending on the errors we get, we may actually not fix it, hopefully all by today, depending on the error you get. But we'll take a look. All right. So what we need to do is, oh, I totally forgot. There's one final thing we really need to do. We've synced our routes, we've used our models, but we never really synced our database with our server. I totally forgot about that. So what we need to do is we need to actually also access our database object that we created in our models inside of this file as well. So we're going to require that as well. Specifically go to models. And again, since it's index.js, we don't need to specify the file. In which case, we need to run the specific sequelize method sync. Now, if you save, you're probably going to get an error. Yep. All right, did everyone get an error? Because hopefully you guys should get an error. An error is actually totally fine right now. Depending on your error, I wrote all the different possibilities of what could cause it and what we need to do to fix it. So first things first, the most common one you'll probably see is that whatever you named your database inside of your config file, so I named mine tcsv to do, it'll say tcsv to do does not exist. If everyone has that, we should be good. Does anyone have any other error other than that? All right, I think that's good. Module not found. Okay, yeah, that probably is a typo somewhere. So you don't need to. Oh yeah. So if you don't have your server running, you just do npm start. But since we have nodemon, it should auto refresh every time you make a change. So it should be running if you haven't. But yes, npm start. Rejection, password authentication failed. Okay, so that just means you probably passed in the wrong password for that specific user. So when setting up your Postgres database, there was a process where you had to set up a user and a password. You need to make sure you use that password. Yes, let me go back to server.js. Yeah, it's probably maybe a mistypo here or something. And the order of where I place this doesn't actually matter. I kind of just put it here just because it can actually be like at the bottom or before. I think as long as it is before our server, should be fine. Ooh, dialect needs to be explicitly supplied as of for. Okay, so then that means there's an error on your config file. Make sure you spell Postgres. And it needs to be spelled all lowercase Postgres. So yes, I try to find, oh, it does say that. That is unfortunate. Dialect needs to be explicitly supplied as. Okay, so then that could also mean your model, the index.js model. Did you make sure that your SQLized instance has this object that has both the host and the dialect, specifically accessing the dialect? And yeah, I tried to actually look for all the possible errors that can happen. So there are definitely some that I definitely missed, but hopefully it's okay. There we go. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, because dialect, it's not necessarily like a constant because depending on your database, you might change that. So that's why it's lowercase. Oh no. Oh no. Let's see. Is this one lowercase and this lowercase as well? There we go. That's probably what it was. Okay. So hopefully it's working, but I'm going to move on so that way we can actually create our database. All right. And we'll create our database and test out our server to make sure it's working. So yeah. So what we're going to do is I want everyone to create either a new terminal or a new bash, something that we can access the terminal. Now, we want to be able to create a database. Now, in order to actually create a database, we actually need to go into pSQL, which is basically the command line to actually enter what our PostgreSQL database is. So the command we want to do is psql-u, which stands for username, followed by your username. Typically, if you follow the tutorial, you should have a user called Postgres. Now, for me, I believe I bypassed the password, but you might have to type in your password for that specific user. So if you have to type in a password, make sure you type in the password, and you should be presented with this screen right here. For those of you who get errors, has there anyone that got an error when doing that?
If we're using a command prompt, where should we be running that command?
I think it should work in the command prompt as well, I believe. I actually did not check for command prompt because I think you can also get the pSQL shell as well as an installer, but I didn't take a look at that. But try it out, see what you get. So not recognize command. Ooh, okay. So for Windows computers, you may not have access to that. So I think what you need to do is you need to be able to add the Ooh, I did not foresee this error. You might have to add it to your path so that when you run the pSQL command, it runs to that specific file. I think, wait, did I add that? No, I did not. Oh yeah, I did. So yeah, I think the path is probably something along the lines of like /user /lib/postgresql / whatever version number you have /bin. You want to add that to your path as the pSQL command so that you can access it. And I think that should work. If not, we could probably take a look later to see how we can add that as a command. But for now, for those who are in here, we need to go through a few bit of PostgreSQL commands in order to create our database. So some useful commands to know: \l list out all the databases you have listed on yours. Most of you probably won't have nearly as many databases as I do. You probably will have a PostgreSQL database and maybe some other ones if you went through like a tutorial or something. But that's to show all the databases you have. \du lists all your users. That can be very helpful if you want to use a different user instead of Postgres, in which case you can create users and have them do whatever it is that you need to do. And then the last command is the \q, which exits out of this, which we're going to probably do at the end. All right. So first things first, we want to create a database. So to create a database, we're just going to run the command create database. And then here, we want to make sure that we pass in the database name that we were getting that you put in here, as well as the one that was in the error, because that should be the same. Since mine is tcsb-to-do, I'll put that. Make sure you put yours and end it with a semicolon. In PostgreSQL, every line that you write ends in a semicolon. Oh, and yeah, also make sure your name of your database is in quotation marks. And you should see something like this. This confirms that your database is created. You can confirm by doing \l. And here I have a tcsb-to-do database. All right, so that creates my database. So now, if I go back to my NodeMon server and refresh it, fastest way to refresh is just to make a simple line change, save it, and it should auto load. And then here we go. Now I don't get an error anymore. Now that I have that database, since that database exists, I can actually do things. All right, so now this was something I forgot to mention, which would have been helpful to have beforehand, but we want to be able to test our routes. The simplest route we can do is the localhost 8080 API/to-dos. That is unfortunate. Cannot read property find all of undefined. Ooh, that's embarrassing. All right, exports.read. Exports.read. Gotta check my routes. Controller.read. Ooh. Res.send data. To-do.find all. Oh no. Cannot read property find all of undefined. So to do. Cannot read property. Controller. Interesting. Oh wait, I totally blanked on something, didn't I? I did. Okay, so everyone should be getting this if I skip something, which I think I did. Right, that's right. We need to go back into our index.js. See, this is why I made notes and I didn't even follow my own notes. So what we need is to add one line. We need to say that we need to access this right here and put it inside of here as our database. So what that means is we have to do, let me make sure I get the exact thing. Yes. So here, we need to add a line into our index.js. And we got to say db.todos, right? Because based off of here, oh, or was it? Yes, our controller, we're actually accessing our database that has the todos property, but we never gave it a todos property. So here we'll say db.todos equals, and here we're just going to require our to-do model. So it'll be to-do.models.js. Basically the file name of your to-do. And then that should save. Ooh, did I misspell it? To-do.models.js. Can't find module.
I think it's model singular.
Oh yes, I definitely named it model. Thank you. All right, now that is working. If I were to refresh this, to-do.findAll is not a function. Oh no. Oh no, this is unfortunate. To-do.findAll is not a function. So that means our controller here, to-do.findAll. Oh no. What went wrong? Let's see. Controller. Oh, that's why I didn't finish this. So our to-do model, it was a function that we passed in. So we need to pass in both the instance of Sequelize and the module Sequelize. So here we have to pass in Sequelize and Sequelize. All right, because we're returning or we're exporting a function that has the instance and the module. So here we're passing the instance and the module, and that should work. Okay, if you see this, this is a very good sign. That explains a lot. If you see this, this means that you actually created a table in your database. Specifically, you created your to-dos table. And now if I go here and refresh, I should get nothing because I don't have anything in my database. Perfect. But yes, we want to probably also test out our other routes other than just get all. We probably also want to test out our post route, our update route, and our delete route. But I think we pretty much ran out of time, unfortunately. and this is another thing I didn't mention, but it's probably also helpful to have some type of either extension or tool that lets you actually make these requests. Mostly because when you enter it in like your browser, you're only making GET request because you're not sending specific data. Whereas for like specific applications, you can enter exactly what it is that you want to do, what route you want to do, specify the type of route it is. In this case, I want to create a to-do. Here, I need to make sure that my header content type is application JSON. And then in the body, in this case, I could do a JSON, in which case I could do something like task walk the dog. All right, so now I'm actually sending data because it's a post request. And then when I send it, I get a status of 200. So remember, status of 500 meant that there was an error, a server error. 400 would have meant that an error happened on my end. Status 200 means it was successful. So now, if I were to refresh this, it's in my database. And I have my walk the dog task. So yeah, this extension is actually very helpful. It's called the RESTman. If you want to use that, definitely go ahead. Another thing I use also is Postman. Postman is probably going to be something that's very nice to have. It actually keeps track of everything you've done. So in case you want to like go back to it or just change a little bit here and there, you can use that and do. And I think Postman is a very popular application, especially when working with backend servers and stuff. But yeah, but if you don't want to download a whole nother application, definitely RESTman to test out your routes. But yeah. Yes, thank you, Casey and Nick, for the input. But yes, I think that's probably, ooh, great job, Oliver. Hopefully you guys have your databases installed. If you guys need me to look at any of my code, definitely just ask real quick and I can just put that up. But I think we're pretty much done. I think also, this was just literally just the back end. There was a lot that went into it. I also made sure it was organized so that it was hopefully understandable. But I think next time we're going to now connect our back end to our front end. But yeah, hopefully all of you guys have your databases and everything ready. If you have time in the meantime, try testing out your routes to make sure it works. If you have any errors or any questions, definitely just post in the Discord and I'll try my best to kind of answer them. But yeah, thank you everyone for coming and have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you so much, Eddie.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you.
How have you been, Eddie?
Tired.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you can sleep all day tomorrow.
I don't think so. I'm actually in the process of moving, so I have to do all of that tomorrow.
Oh no.
Yes. But yes, hopefully after that I'll get some sleep.
Yeah. Sleep for a week.
Yes.
All right. Well, my computer's gonna die soon, but thank you so much.
Yes, have your computer rest.
Bye.
See you, Alice.
Wait, Eddie, did you want to meet up sometime this week to discuss the last session or?
Yeah, definitely. I won't be free tomorrow.
Sorry, I'll leave. I was trying to figure it out, but well.
No, you're good, Nick.
All right, bye guys. Thank you so much.
Yeah, see you, Nick. When are you free this week?
I mean, I could do it right now too if you want to do right now.
I unfortunately cannot do right now.
Okay.
I'm actually moving also today and tomorrow, so yes,
Oh my
like
gosh.
I think my roommate is literally calling me right now, but that's fine.
Okay. Are you
Does
free or what? Actually, you're probably busier than me, so do you have a preferred
I mean
time?
after Sunday I should be fine. So anytime after Sunday I'm pretty much open.
Are you down for like Tuesday sometime?
Okay, I can do Tuesday.
Uh, mm,
Tuesday after 7.
yeah, that's fine with me. So you want
Okay,
to do like 8 o'clock on Tuesday?
that works with me.
Okay, cool. Let me put that down.
Yeah,
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Good job today, Eddie.
thanks.
Really good.
I hope.
No, it was good. I followed along too. So,
Okay.
okay. Well, I'll talk to you on Tuesday.
Yes. See you,
Bye,
Casey.
Eddie. Have fun moving.
I will.